This is chapter 15 of Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserly father. And though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming at it any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement, and the consequential feelings of early and unexpected prosperity. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank and his veneration for her as a patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride and obsequiousness, self-importance and humility. So Mr. Collins is kind of a weird mix of personality traits. So on the one hand, he was raised by a father who was illiterate, so could not read or write, and a father who was miserly. So someone who's miserly is very money conscious, but in a sense where they won't make any unnecessary or frivolous purchases, and they're also not very giving towards others. So they tend to hoard whatever they have and not share it. So he grew up in an environment where he had to be very humble. But when he went to college and university, and once he got Lady Catherine de Bourgh's patronage, he became more proud of himself and became proud of his work as a minister and a preacher. So he's this weird sort of mixture of being very pompous and then being weirdly servile and humble. So watch out for that. You'll see more of it in this chapter, but we've already seen it in previous chapters. Having now a good house and very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking a reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and suitableness, and excessively generous and disinterested on his own part. So Mr. Collins has an objective when he comes to Longbourn, and yes, he is the cousin of the Bennets, but he wants to marry one of the Bennet daughters. His reasoning for that, he wants to have a wife as a minister. In the previous chapter, he mentions that Lady Catherine even condescended to tell him that he should marry soon. And because Longbourn is entailed to him, he feels weirdly guilty about inheriting it. So he figures if he marries one of the Bennet daughters, it won't be as bad because at least one of them will still get to benefit from this property. So that's his objective. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views and established all his strictest notions of what was due to seniority. And for the first evening, she was his settled choice. If you remember, we've talked about this before. Your oldest unmarried daughter would always be called Miss and then their last name, and all of the younger siblings, the younger daughters, would be called Miss, their first name. So when he says Miss Bennet, he's referring to Jane Bennet, the oldest daughter. Elizabeth would be Miss Elizabeth, unless, of course, Jane were married, in which case she would then become Miss Bennet. All right, so he decides that he's going to marry Jane. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his parsonage house, and leading naturally to the avowal of his hopes that a mistress for it might be found at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her to say, she could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she must just mention, she felt it incumbent on her to hint, was likely to be very soon engaged. So Mr. Collins talks to Mrs. Bennet, and she's like, I wouldn't propose to Jane because she may get engaged to Mr. Bingley very soon. If you're looking at the text, you will also see quotation marks around that little section. So although your pronouns are a little bit different, so we have, as to her youngest daughter, she could not take upon her to say. Jane Austen's writing as if Mrs. Bennet were speaking this. So although we don't have her using first person pronouns, she doesn't say in quotes, although my daughters, she's saying her daughters. The quotation marks are meant to show that this is similar to, if not exactly, what she's saying. It's just an older form of dialogue that you see in older writing. It fades out of popularity. Obviously, we don't have this so much in modern literature, but you do see it sometimes. It's meant to mirror dialogue without quite being dialogue. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done while Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire. Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. So, Mr. Collins wants to marry A. Bennet to make up for inheriting Longbourn. He picks Jane, and then Mrs. Bennet tells him, no, I wouldn't, she's gonna marry someone else. And then he decides, okay, Elizabeth is the next best Bennet, she's the next youngest, she's the next prettiest, okay, she's gonna be my new objective for a wife. So, this doesn't happen in a very long span of time. It just takes Mrs. Bennet to, she's stirring the fire, so she, makes it a little warmer in the room, and it's only, that little bit of time where he decides to change the idea of who he's going to marry. So this isn't very important in terms of romance for Mr. Collins. He is basically looking to fulfill a position. It's kind of like a job position. Mrs. Bennet treasured up the hint and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. So just like Mr. Collins goes from one daughter to the next, Mrs. Bennet pretty quickly changes her opinion of Mr. Collins. At first she hates him because he's going to take away her daughter's house and chances for happiness in the future, and now that he may marry one of them, she's all for him. She's Team Collins. Great. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go to her, and Mr. Collins agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them, at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him and have his library to himself, for thither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, nominally engaged with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet, with little cessation, of his house and garden at Hunsford. Such doings discomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. In his library he had always been sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room in the house, he was used to be free from them there. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk. And Mr. Collins, being in fact much better fitted for a walker than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his large book and go. So Mr. Bennet has his kind of like man cave in the library. He enjoys getting away from everyone there. It's an escape. And Mr. Collins follows him in there, won't stop talking to him. So he says, oh, go on a walk with the girls. Go ahead. And then Mr. Collins says, okay, right away, because he is not too into the reading vibe. There's also a dig at the poor Bennets. So Mr. Bennet thinks that he was... He told Elizabeth he's prepared to meet with folly and conceit in every other room in the house. So he expects that once he leaves his library and has to interact with his family members, there's going to be all of this goofiness and frivolity going on around him. He's not the happiest person with his family situation. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assents on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window could recall them. So Kitty and Lydia are very focused on 2 things: the guys in the militia, that's 1, and then fashion, that's 2. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air, all wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street under pretense of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and, he was happy to say, had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favor. He had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. In other words, this Mr. Wickham guy is really handsome. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation, a readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming. And the whole party were still standing and talking together very agreeably when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. So just something to note also, that Mr. Wickham not only is very handsome, but he's also very friendly. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them, and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger. And Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat, a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. So they run into this guy, Mr. Wickham, and they run into Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley. They were on their way to Longbourn. Bingley was going to see Jane. And then something weird happens. Wickham and Darcy look at each other. One of them goes pale, the other one flushes red, and there's some weirdness going on, but they're very civil and cordial to each other. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia's pressing entreaties that they would come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlor window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest from their recent absence were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she should have known nothing about, if she had not happened to see Mr. Jones's shop-boy in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more draughts to Netherfield, because the Miss Bennets were come away, when her civility was claimed toward Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion, without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put an end to by exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the shire. So a few things happening. They get to their aunt's house, Mrs. Phillips. They introduce Mr. Collins to her. I kind of feel a little bad for Mr. Collins here because she meets him, and then immediately everyone's attention is redirected to Mr. Wickham because he's much more interesting and much more attractive. So they only really know that he's joining the militia, so he'll have the red coat, be really attractive to Kitty and Lydia because that's all they care about. They know that. They know that he is a friend of Mr. Denny's, and that's about it. There's not too much information to share there. He is to have a lieutenant's commission, which would be a pretty good position. If you are looking at the text, you'll probably see a dash next to Shire. So this is just because there's no specific neighborhood or place that Jane Austen is naming. It's just supposed to sort of be any place, kind of like an anonymous entry. But you'll see that throughout this novel, and you'll also see it in other Regency and I think even some Victorian works of literature do the same thing. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation. But unluckily, no one passed the windows, except a few of the officers, who in comparison with the stranger were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. So these other officers are not as handsome as Mr. Wickham. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham, and give him an invitation also if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured with unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen. But though Jane would have defended either or both had they appeared to be wrong, she could no more explain such behavior than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that, except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but had even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown to her before. Something he supposed might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. We can tell from Mr. Collins's speech that he's a little bit hyperbolic. He tends to fluff things up a lot. He thinks this is the nicest thing ever that he was invited to dinner. And even Jane is perplexed by the Mr. Darcy Wickham weirdness. And that is chapter 15.